What if I told you that in just 4 years, 1/3 of Europe's entire population would vanish? What if surviving meant watching your neighbors pile corpses like cordwood in the streets? What if the very people meant to comfort you in death, the priests and physicians, fled in terror at your approach? Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most devastating pandemics, the Black Death of the 14th century, and discover why being a medieval plague victim meant experiencing not just physical agony, but the complete breakdown of everything that made life worth living. Welcome back to Boring History to Sleep, where we take these incredible journeys through the past. Before we begin tonight's exploration into medieval Europe's darkest hour, I'm curious, where are you checking in from tonight? Whether you're settling in for the evening or perhaps listening during a quiet afternoon, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you relax and learn, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to join our growing community. And please, leave a comment below about what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. Or simply check in and let us know how you're doing. Every comment helps build this wonderful community we've created together. And your continued support means everything to making these deep historical explorations possible. Now might be a perfect time to dim those lights and get comfortable as we step back nearly 7 centuries to witness one of humanity's greatest trials. Tonight, we'll walk through the horrifying reality of being a plague victim. Meet Giovanni Boccaccio, who documented civilization's collapse. Uncover the mysterious reasons why some people survived when so many perished. So settle in and let's begin our journey to 14th century Europe, where death wore a black hood and knocked on every door. Why? It sucked to be a medieval plague victim. It's 1348, and you're living in a bustling medieval city. Your life, while not luxurious by modern standards, has a certain rhythm and predictability. You wake each morning to the sound of church bells, spend your days working at your trade, whether that's weaving cloth, baking bread, or shoeing horses. Your evenings are spent with family around a simple meal, sharing stories and planning for tomorrow. But tomorrow, as you know it, is about to disappear forever. The first sign that something terrible is approaching your city comes in whispers from traveling merchants. They speak of entire towns in the east that have fallen silent, of ships arriving in ports with no living souls aboard their decks. You dismiss these as the wild tales that merchants always tell, meant to explain delays in trade or justify higher prices for goods that have become scarce. But then the rumors grow more specific, more frightening. A merchant from Genoa describes black swellings, the size of apples, growing on people's necks. A pilgrim returning from Constantinople tells of streets so filled with corpses. A sailor whispers of a pestilence that kills so quickly the people go to bed healthy and are found dead by morning, their faces black and their bodies covered in dark blotches. You try to push these horrifying tales from your mind, but deep down, a cold fear begins to settle in your stomach. This fear grows stronger when you notice that fewer ships are arriving at your city's port, and the ones that do arrive carry crews that seem nervous. Some ships approach your harbor, only to sail away again without docking, as if the sailors themselves are afraid of what they might bring ashore. Then, On what seems like an ordinary Tuesday morning in early autumn, everything changes. You're walking through the market square when you see a crowd gathered around something on the ground. Pushing through the circle of onlookers, you see a man you recognize, lying motionless on the cobblestones. His face is flushed with fever, his breathing is labored and shallow, and most terrifying of all, the crowd backs away in horrified silence. No one moves to help him, no one even speaks. They simply stare, and then, one by one, they hurry away. You want to help. Every instinct tells you to help. But the fear that grips your chest is unlike anything you've ever experienced. You back away too, and the image of Thomas's suffering face burns itself into your memory. Within hours, word spreads through your city like wildfire. The pestilence has arrived. By evening, 3 more cases have been discovered. By the end of the week, dozens of people are showing the terrifying symptoms. The black swellings, which people begin calling buboes, appear most commonly in the armpits. They start as small, tender lumps, but quickly grow to the size of eggs or even apples, becoming so painful, but you're still healthy. Still hoping that perhaps you'll be among the lucky ones who somehow escape this horror. You pray more fervently than ever before, attend Mass twice, and even donate precious coins to the church, hoping that God will protect you and your family. You avoid the sections of the city where the sick are said to live. You wash your hands more frequently, and you try to eat only foods that seem wholesome and pure. Your precautions seem to be working. Weeks pass, and while the death toll in your city climbs alarmingly, you and your family remain healthy. The bells that once called people to prayer now toll constantly for the dead. The cheerful sounds of commerce and daily life are replaced by the rumble of death carts. The drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead," in voices that have grown hoarse from repetition. But then, on a cold morning in November, you wake with what feels like the beginning of a common winter cold. Your throat is scratchy, your head aches slightly, and you feel more tired than usual. You'll tell yourself it's nothing, just the changing season, just the stress of living through these terrible times. You go about your daily routine, but by afternoon, the ache in your head has become a pounding that makes it difficult to concentrate on your work. By evening, you know with absolute certainty that your worst fears have come true. The fever hits you like a physical blow, sending chills racing through your body one moment and making your skin feel like it's burning the next. Your vision becomes blurry, and simple tasks, like walking across your small home, but the fever is only the beginning of your nightmare. The buboes appear first as small, tender spots, barely noticeable lumps under the skin in your armpits. At first, you might convince yourself they're just swollen from the fever, but within hours, they begin to grow. The pain is unlike anything you've ever experienced. Throbbing agony that radiates through your entire body with every heartbeat. Sleep becomes impossible. Every movement, every breath, sends waves of pain through your body. The buboes continue to grow, stretching your skin until it feels ready to burst. The pain is so intense that you cannot bear even the lightest touch of your clothing against your skin. Your family members, terrified and heartbroken, can do nothing but watch. As the days pass, your condition deteriorates rapidly. The fever climbs higher. making you delirious and confused. You begin to lose track of time, unsure whether it's day or night, unable to recognize familiar faces. Sometimes you think you're back in your childhood home, calling out for parents who died years ago. Other times you believe you're surrounded by demons or angels, unable to distinguish between hallucination and reality. New symptoms appear with terrifying regularity. Dark, purplish black spots begin to appear on your skin. First as small dots, but quickly spreading and growing larger. These subcutaneous hemorrhages, as modern medicine would later understand them, are a sign that the infection has spread throughout your bloodstream, affecting your body's ability to clot blood. Your breathing becomes increasingly labored and painful. Each breath feels like you're drowning, as fluid begins to accumulate in your lungs. You develop a horrible cough that brings up blood, staining your lips and the cloth your family uses to wipe your mouth. The metallic taste of blood becomes constant in your mouth, mixing with the foul taste that the fever has left on your tongue. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all is the social isolation that accompanies your physical suffering. Your friends and neighbors, people you've known your entire life, cross the street to avoid passing near your home. The physician who once treated your family's minor ailments refuses to enter your house, claiming there's nothing he can do, and that exposure would only mean his own death. Even more devastating is the reaction of your local priest when your family sends word that you need last rites. The man who has guided your spiritual life since childhood sends back a message claiming, God will understand if the sacraments cannot be properly administered during these terrible times. The comfort of religious ritual, the hope of proper preparation for death, is denied to you. Your family faces an impossible choice. They can care for you, risking their own lives with every moment they spend in your presence, or they can abandon you to die alone. Most choose love over safety, tending to you despite the danger. But this means they too will likely fall victim to the same fate. You watch through your fevered delirium as first your spouse, then your children, begin to show the same terrible symptoms you've endured. The final stages of your illness bring both physical and psychological torment. The buboes may burst, releasing foul-smelling pus that provides only temporary relief from the pressure. Your body begins to shut down systematically. You lose control of basic bodily functions, adding humiliation to your suffering. Delirium becomes your constant companion. You slip in and out of consciousness, sometimes unaware of your surroundings. When you are aware, the world seems like a nightmare from which you cannot wake. The faces of your loved ones seem to shift and change, sometimes appearing as monsters. The psychological torment may be worse than the physical pain. You're forced to confront the possibility that this suffering might be punishment for sins you're not even aware of committing. The Church teaches that pestilence is God's judgment. But what could you have done? This spiritual crisis accompanies your physical decline, leaving you feeling abandoned not just by friends and neighbors, but by God Himself. If you're among the majority who die from the plague, death comes as a mercy after days. Your final hours are marked by increasing difficulty breathing, periods of unconsciousness that grow longer and more frequent, and a gradual cooling of your body. Your family, if any survive, must then face the horror of disposing of your body with no proper funeral rites. But perhaps what makes being a medieval plague victim truly unbearable isn't just the physical agony. It's the complete breakdown of everything that gives life meaning. The social bonds that define your existence. The religious comfort that promises meaning in suffering. The basic human connections that make life worth living. All of these dissolve in the face of the pestilence. You die not just from disease, but from isolation. Abandoned by a world too terrified to offer comfort. In a time when medical knowledge provides no hope and religious faith offers no solace, your death is not heroic or meaningful, but simply one among countless thousands, unmarked and unmourned, in a world that has forgotten how to grieve properly. This is why it sucked to be a medieval plague victim. Not just because of the buboes, the fever, or the pain, but because you faced the ultimate human nightmare, dying alone, abandoned and forgotten in a world where even death had lost its dignity. Giovanni Boccaccio, the writer who documented civilization's collapse, in the summer of 1348, while death stalked the streets of Florence like a relentless hunter, a young man named Giovanni Boccaccio sat in his study, quill in hand, attempting to capture in words what no human mind should ever have to witness. At 35 years old, Boccaccio had already established himself as a promising writer and scholar. Giovanni Boccaccio was born in 1313. Most likely in the village of though some sources suggest he may have been born in Paris during his father's business travels. His father, Boccaccio D., was a successful merchant who worked for the powerful Bardi banking house, one of the most influential financial institutions in medieval Europe. This connection to commerce and international trade would shape young Giovanni's worldview, exposing him from an early age to stories of distant lands. As a child, Giovanni displayed an exceptional gift for language and storytelling, while other boys his age were learning trades or preparing for lives as farmers. Giovanni was sent to Naples to study canon law, a practical choice that would prepare him for a lucrative career in the church hierarchy. However, his heart was never in legal studies. Instead, he found himself drawn to the ancient classical texts that were beginning to resurface in medieval universities. During his time in Naples, Giovanni fell under the influence of scholars. These men were beginning to look backward to classical antiquity for inspiration, believing that the ancient Greeks and Romans had achieved heights of artistic and intellectual accomplishment Europe had lost. This classical influence would profoundly shape Giovanni's writing style and his approach to documenting human experience. By the 1340s, Boccaccio had returned to Florence and established himself as part of the city's vibrant intellectual community. Florence in this period was one of Europe's most prosperous and cultured cities, a place where merchants, scholars, artists, and craftsmen created a sophisticated urban society, unlike anything that had existed since the fall of Rome. Built on banking and textile production, supported a flowering of art and literature that attracted talented individuals from across Europe. Boccaccio's circle included some of the most brilliant minds of his generation. He was a close friend and correspondent of Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch. Together, these men were developing new approaches to literature and scholarship that emphasized individual human experience rather than purely religious themes. They believed that earthly life with all its joys and sorrows, was worthy of serious artistic attention. In the years leading up to the plague, Giovanni had already completed several significant works, including a romantic poem that would later inspire Geoffrey Chaucer's Undisturbed, an epic poem about ancient Thebes. These works established his reputation as a master storyteller who could weave together classical mythology. But nothing in Giovanni's comfortable. Scholarly life prepared him for what began to unfold. In Florence during the spring of 1348, the first reports of plague reaching Italian ports were initially dismissed as exaggerated rumors from nervous merchants. However, as ships from the eastern Mediterranean began arriving with crews decimated by disease, and as the pestilence began to appear in Italian cities, it became clear that something unprecedented. Giovanni watched with growing horror as the plague transformed his beloved Florence from a vibrant center of commerce and culture into a charnel house. The city that had been home to roughly 100,000 people would lose 60,000 and 80,000 residents before the plague finally burned itself out. But for Giovanni, this wasn't simply a matter of statistics. These were his friends, his neighbors, his entire world. As the educated man from a prosperous family, Giovanni initially had access to the best medical care available in medieval Europe. Florence boasted some of the most renowned physicians of the age. Men who had studied at the prestigious universities of Bologna and Padua. Giovanni quickly discovered that even the most learned doctors were completely helpless against this new pestilence. Their traditional remedies, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and prayers. What may have been even more shocking to Giovanni than the failure of medicine was the complete breakdown of social institutions that had seemed permanent and unshakable, which provided the moral and spiritual framework for medieval life, simply disintegrated. Priests died in such numbers that there were not enough clergy left. Those priests who survived often fled the city entirely, abandoning their flocks in their moment of greatest need. Giovanni witnessed scenes that challenged everything he had been taught about human nature. He saw parents abandon their children when the children showed signs of plague, too terrified of infection. He watched as husbands deserted wives and wives fled from husbands, as lifelong friendships dissolved in the face of mortal terror. Even more disturbing, he observed the complete breakdown of legal and social order. The economic system that had made Florence prosperous collapsed. The banks that had financed trade across Europe shuttered their doors as their employees died or fled. Markets that had operated continuously for centuries stood empty, not because there were no goods to sell, but because there were no longer enough living people to maintain. The complex networks of trade and commerce that kept a medieval city functioning. Perhaps most psychologically devastating for a man, Giovanni's intellectual temperament was watching the systematic destruction of Florence's cultural and educational institutions. The universities closed as professors and students died or scattered. Libraries were abandoned, their precious manuscripts left to gather dust as the scholars who had dedicated their lives. But rather than fleeing himself, Giovanni made a decision that would prove crucial for historical understanding of the plague. He chose to stay in Florence and document what he was witnessing. Using his skills as a writer and his training in classical rhetoric, he began to record not just the facts of the plague's devastation, but the human experience of living through the complete collapse of civilization. Giovanni's most famous account of the plague appears in the introduction to his masterwork, the Decameron, which he began writing in 1348, during the height of the pestilence. In this introduction, he provides one of the most vivid and detailed contemporary accounts of the Black Death's impact. His description is all the more powerful because it combines the observational skills of a trained scholar. He wrote of seeing respected citizens reduced to scavenging for food in abandoned houses, of noble families dying in complete isolation because their servants, of bodies piling up in the streets because there were no longer enough living people to bury the dead properly. His account captures not just the physical horror of the plague, but the psychological trauma of watching an entire way of life disappear. But Giovanni's genius lay not just in documenting the destruction, but in recognizing that this catastrophe represented a fundamental turning point in human history. He understood that the world emerging from the plague would be fundamentally different from the world that had existed before it. The certainties that had guided medieval life, the unquestioned authority of church and traditional social hierarchies, the belief that suffering was simply God's will. In response to this realization, Giovanni began to develop a new approach to literature and human understanding that would help define the Renaissance, rather than focusing exclusively on religious themes or classical mythology. He began to explore the full range of human experience, including the earthly. He believed that if traditional authorities could not provide adequate explanations for human suffering, then individuals must learn to navigate the world using their own reason, observation, and emotional intelligence. The Decameron itself represents this new approach. The frame story tells of 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, who flee the plague-stricken city and take refuge in a villa in the countryside to pass the time and distract themselves from the horror they have left behind. They tell each other stories, 100 tales in total, that explore every aspect of human nature. The structure of the Decameron was revolutionary. Rather than presenting a single moral lesson or religious truth, the collection offers a panoramic view of human behavior in all its complexity. Some stories celebrate virtue and divine providence, while others mock religious hypocrisy and social pretension. Some tales are tragic and moving, while others are comic and irreverent. Together, they present a vision of humanity that is neither wholly good nor wholly evil. This approach represented a dramatic departure from medieval literary traditions, which typically sought to provide clear moral instruction and reinforce established religious and social hierarchies. Giovanni's work suggested instead that human experience was too complex and varied to be reduced to simple moral categories, and that literature's proper role was to explore this complexity rather than to provide easy answers. The impact of Giovanni's plague experience extended far beyond his literary work. His correspondence with other scholars and writers spread his ideas about the need for new approaches to understanding human nature and society. His influence helped shape the thinking of later Renaissance figures, including Christine de Pizan, Geoffrey Chaucer, and ultimately writers like William Shakespeare, who would further develop the Renaissance focus on individual human psychology and experience. Giovanni's documentation of the plague also served a crucial historical function, because he was both an eyewitness to the events and a skilled writer capable of capturing their significance. His accounts provide modern historians with invaluable insights into not just, but how contemporary people understood and responded to these catastrophic events. Perhaps most importantly, Giovanni's work demonstrates how great art can emerge from the deepest human suffering, rather than being crushed or silenced by the horror he witnessed. He found ways to transform that experience into literature that would speak to readers for centuries to come. His ability to find meaning and even beauty in the midst of civilizational collapse provided a model for how human creativity and resilience can survive even the worst catastrophes. By the time the plague finally began to subside in Florence during 1349, Giovanni had established himself not just as a chronicler of disaster, but as a visionary who understood that the old world was ending. His work helped lay the intellectual foundation for the Renaissance by demonstrating that individuals could and must take responsibility for making sense of their own experience, rather than simply accepting traditional explanations for human suffering and social organization. Giovanni Boccaccio lived until 1375. Long enough to see some of the cultural and intellectual changes he had anticipated. He continued writing and teaching, helping to preserve and transmit classical knowledge. But his greatest achievement remains his decision to stay in plague-stricken Florence, transforming that witness into art that continues to illuminate the human condition more than 6 centuries later. The mystery of plague immunity, why some medieval people survived. In the midst of Europe's darkest hour, when the Black Death claimed the lives of 1 in every 3 people, something remarkable and puzzling occurred. Scattered across the plague-stricken continent were individuals who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to survive. These people worked alongside the dying, cared for plague victims, and lived in the most infected areas. Yet they never succumbed to the pestilence that killed their neighbors, friends, and family members. For centuries, their survival remained one of history's greatest medical. Take the case of a woman we know only as Margaret the midwife, who lived in the English city of York during the plague years. Historical records from the city's guild documents tell us that Margaret continued delivering babies throughout 1348 and 1349, entering homes where entire families lay dying, handling newborns whose mothers had active plague symptoms, and working in conditions that should have guaranteed her infection. Yet Margaret not only survived the initial plague outbreak, but lived well into the 1360s. Or consider the mysterious survival of entire families scattered across different regions of Europe. In the Bavarian village of local chronicles record that certain households remained completely untouched by the plague, despite being surrounded by infected neighbors. In some cases, these families actually took in orphaned children from plague victims, yet none of the adoptive family members ever developed symptoms. Similar patterns appeared in isolated pockets across France, Italy, and England. Perhaps most intriguing were the accounts of individuals who seemed to develop only mild symptoms when exposed to the plague. These people might develop slight fevers, relatively painless swellings, but they recovered quickly and never experienced the agonizing buboes and black hemorrhages. Medieval chroniclers noted these cases with wonder, often attributing such miraculous recoveries to divine intervention. Medieval physicians, working with the limited understanding of disease available to them, struggled to explain these mysterious survivals. The dominant medical theory of the time, based on the ancient Greek physician Galen's teachings about the four humors, suggested that plague was caused by corrupted air, or miasma, that infected people by disrupting the natural balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile in their bodies. According to this theory, survival should have depended on maintaining proper humoral balance through diet. However, medieval doctors quickly noticed that their treatments seemed to have no consistent effect. Some patients who received extensive medical care died horribly, while others who received no treatment at all recovered completely. Some people who followed strict dietary regimens and underwent regular bloodletting succumbed quickly to the plague, while others who lived seemingly unhealthy lifestyles showed complete resistance to infection. This inconsistency led some medieval thinkers to propose alternative explanations for survival. Religious authorities often claimed that resistance to plague was a sign of divine favor, suggesting that the pure of heart and strong of faith would be protected by God's grace. However, this explanation proved equally unsatisfactory, including many clergy members died in large numbers, while some people of questionable moral character. Other medieval theories focused on lifestyle factors. Some physicians noticed that people who lived in cleaner conditions or had access to better food seemed to have higher survival rates. Others observed that individuals who lived in stone houses rather than wooden ones, or who had access to running water. These observations contained kernels of truth, though medieval thinkers lacked the scientific framework to understand why these factors might matter. The true explanation for plague immunity would remain hidden for more than 6 centuries, until modern genetic research began to unlock the secrets written in human DNA. In the 1990s, scientists studying the HIV epidemic made a remarkable discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of both AIDS and medieval plague. They found that some people possessed a genetic mutation that made them resistant to HIV infection. The key lies in a gene called CCR5, which codes for a protein that sits on the surface of certain immune system cells. This protein normally serves as a receptor, a kind of doorway that allows various substances to enter cells. However, some people inherit a mutated version of this gene, which produces a defective protein that cannot function as a proper receptor. For most of human history, this mutation was probably disadvantageous, since it interfered with normal immune system function. However, when the plague bacterium began devastating human populations, this genetic defect suddenly became a life-saving advantage. The mutated CCR5 protein appears to make it much more difficult for the plague bacterium to infect certain key immune system cells, providing significant protection against the disease. Modern genetic studies have revealed fascinating patterns in the distribution of the CCR5 delta, 32 mutation across European populations. The highest frequencies of this mutation, Southern European populations have lower frequencies, typically ranging from 4 to 8%. Most remarkably, the mutation is virtually absent in African. The geographic distribution of the CCR5 Delta 3-2 mutation, historical records of plague outbreaks and survival rates, regions where the mutation is most common today, correspond to areas that experience severe plague outbreaks. This correlation provides strong evidence that the Black Death acted as a powerful selective pressure, dramatically increasing the frequency of a genetic variant that had previously been rare in human populations. Computer models created by population geneticists suggest that before the 14th century plague, the CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation probably existed in less than 2% of European populations. However, the massive death toll of the Black Death, combined with the significant survival advantage, could have increased its frequency to current levels in just a few generations. This represents one of the most dramatic examples of rapid human evolution, but genetics alone cannot explain all the mysteries of medieval plague survival. Environmental and social factors also played crucial roles. Archaeological evidence from plague cemeteries reveals important patterns related to nutrition, living conditions, and social status that help explain survival rates beyond genetic factors. Studies of skeletal remains from medieval plague victims show clear evidence of malnutrition. People who were already weakened by poor diet, parasitic infections, or other health problems were much more likely to die quickly from plague. Conversely, individuals who had access to adequate nutrition and lived in less crowded conditions, regardless of their genetic makeup, the role of hygiene in plague survival was more complex than medieval people understood. While they correctly observed that cleaner living conditions seemed to provide some protection, they didn't understand the mechanism involved. We now know that plague is primarily transmitted by fleas that live on rodents, people who lived in stone buildings with fewer hiding places for rats, who kept cats that controlled rodent, or who simply happened to live in areas with fewer rats, had reduced exposure to infected fleas. Interestingly, some medieval practices that were intended to prevent plague may have actually provided real protection through mechanisms their practitioners didn't understand. The use of strong-smelling herbs and spices, while useless against airborne miasma, may have helped repel fleas. Certain religious practices, such as frequent washing and changing of clothes, would have reduced flea populations on human hosts. Even the practice of burning incense in aromatic woods might have had some insect-repelling effects. Medieval records also reveal the importance of timing in plague survival. People who were exposed to the disease during its initial, most virulent phase had much lower survival rates than those who encountered it during later. This pattern suggests that the plague bacterium itself may have evolved during its spread across Europe, becoming less lethal over time, as strains that killed their hosts too quickly were selected against. Social and economic factors created additional layers of complexity and survival patterns. Wealthy individuals who could afford to flee infected cities had obvious advantages, but even among those who remained, social class affected survival in surprising ways. Some studies suggest that members of the merchant and artisan classes who had more contact with international trade networks may have developed some immunity through earlier exposure to related diseases. Conversely, isolated rural populations that had little previous exposure to epidemic diseases. The mystery of plague immunity also extends to entire communities that seem to escape infection. The Alpine village of Oberammergau, which we mentioned earlier, attributed its survival to a religious vow made by its inhabitants. However, geographic isolation and possibly genetic factors related to the village's founding population all likely contributed to their remarkable escape from the pandemic. Modern research has also revealed the existence of multiple plague-related genetic variants beyond the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. Other genes involved in immune system function and iron metabolism have been identified as potentially providing protection against plague and other infectious diseases. This suggests that medieval plague survival was influenced by a complex web of genetic factors rather than a single mutation. The study of medieval plague immunity has profound implications for modern medicine. Understanding how genetic variants that protect against one disease can provide resistance to others has informed research into HIV, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases. The rapid evolution of protective mutations in European populations during the medieval period provides a model for understanding how human genetics might respond to future pandemic threats. Perhaps most remarkably, population studies suggest that descendants of Black Death survivors continue to have advantages in fighting certain infectious diseases. This means that the genetic legacy of medieval plague survival is still present, providing a direct biological link between contemporary populations and the survivors. The mystery of plague immunity reminds us that survival during the Black Death was not simply a matter of chance, as medieval people believed, but rather the result of complex interactions between genetics. While we can now explain many aspects of this mystery, new discoveries continue to reveal additional layers of complexity in the story of how some medieval people managed to survive when death seemed to claim everyone around them. These insights into plague immunity also provide a sobering reminder of how infectious diseases have shaped human evolution and continue to influence our species' genetic makeup. The Black Death was not just a historical catastrophe, but an evolutionary event that left permanent marks on human DNA. Marks that continue to influence disease resistance patterns more than 6 centuries after the last medieval plague. Life in a plague-free medieval monastery. As the Black Death ravaged the cities and countryside of 14th century Europe, transforming once thriving communities into charnel houses filled with the dead and dying, there existed scattered across the continent small islands of peace and safety. These sanctuaries were the great monasteries, self-contained religious communities that had spent centuries perfecting the art of isolation. Within their walls, life continued with a rhythm and tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the horror unfolding beyond their gates. Consider the ancient monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, France, one of the most powerful religious institutions in medieval Europe. Founded in 910 by the time of the plague outbreak, Cluny had evolved into a vast complex of stone buildings surrounded by high walls. With its own farms, workshops, libraries, and even hospitals. When reports of the pestilence began reaching the monastery in early 1348, the abbot made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. He ordered the gates sealed and decreed, this decision to isolate completely was not made lightly. Medieval monasteries were typically centers of hospitality, places where travelers could find food and shelter, where the sick could receive care, and where the local community could turn for spiritual guidance during times of crisis. By choosing isolation over their traditional role as providers of charity, The monks of Cluny were making a profound sacrifice of their fundamental mission in order to preserve their community. But this sacrifice proved remarkably effective. While the plague decimated the population of nearby towns and villages, killing clergy and lay people alike in horrifying numbers, the monastery of Cluny, the same pattern repeated itself at monasteries across Europe. Those communities that had the discipline and resources to maintain complete isolation. During the plague years, life within these plague-free monasteries during the Black Death years offers us a fascinating glimpse into how human communities could create bubbles of normalcy and even prosperity. These religious communities had spent centuries developing systems and practices that, quite by accident, proved ideally suited for surviving a pandemic that medieval medical knowledge was powerless to combat. The daily routine at a typical Benedictine monastery during the plague years began long before dawn. The bells of Lauds would ring at around 3 a.m., calling the monks from their simple cells to the first of 8 daily prayer services in the cold stone church, illuminated only by candles and oil lamps. The community would gather to chant the psalms and prayers that had echoed through these same halls for centuries. This unchanging routine provided psychological stability that was invaluable during a time when the outside world seemed to have lost all order and predictability. While cities beyond the monastery walls saw their social structures collapse, their markets close, and their very sense of time disrupted by constant death and chaos. The monastic community maintained the same schedule they had followed for generations. The bells still rang at the appointed hours, meals were still served at regular times, and work continued according to the established patterns that governed monastic life. After Lauds, the monks would return to their cells for a few more hours of rest, before rising again for prime. The prayer service that marked the beginning of the working day. Following a simple breakfast of bread and weak beer, the community would disperse to their various assigned tasks. In a large monastery like Cluny, these tasks encompassed virtually every aspect of medieval economic life, from agriculture and animal husbandry to manuscript copying and goldsmithing. The agricultural work that occupied many of the monks was particularly crucial during the plague years. While secular farming communities saw their workforces devastated by disease, causing widespread crop failures and famine, the isolated monastic communities could continue their agricultural activities without interruption. The monks worked the fields within their walls, tended their vegetable gardens, cared for their livestock. The self-sufficiency that monasteries had developed over centuries proved to be their salvation during the plague years. These communities had never depended heavily on outside trade for their basic necessities. They grew their own food, made their own clothing, brewed their own beer, and even produced their own medicines from herbs grown in their medicinal gardens. This independence meant that when trade networks collapsed and markets closed during the plague years, the monastic diet during this period was simple but adequate, far better than what most secular communities could manage during the chaos of the plague years. Breakfast typically consisted of bread, beer, and perhaps some cheese or fruit. The main meal of the day was served after the midday prayer service, and might include bread, vegetables from the monastery gardens, eggs from the community's chickens, meat from the monastery's livestock. The quality and regularity of monastic meals provided crucial advantages in maintaining health and resistance to disease. While malnutrition weakened plague resistance in the outside world, The monks maintained their strength through consistent access to adequate food. Their diet, while not luxurious, was balanced and nutritious according to medieval standards, including the vegetables, grains, and occasional proteins that supported strong immune systems. The monastery's daily schedule included substantial periods devoted to manual labor, which medieval monks considered essential for both physical health and spiritual development. This work ethic meant that even during the plague years, when depression and despair paralyzed many secular communities, the monastic communities remained active. The physical activity involved in farming, construction, and crafts helped maintain the monks' health, perhaps most importantly for their survival. The monasteries had developed sophisticated systems for maintaining cleanliness and sanitation that were far advanced compared to typical medieval standards. Monastic rules required regular bathing, clean clothing, and careful attention to personal hygiene. The monasteries typically had elaborate systems for providing clean water, disposing of waste. The intellectual life of the monasteries continued to flourish. Even the scriptoriums, where monks copied manuscripts and preserved ancient knowledge, remained centers of learning and culture when universities and schools in the outside world closed due to plague deaths among students and teachers. The great library at Cluny, like those at other major monasteries, continued to grow during the plague years. The preservation of knowledge during this period cannot be overstated in its historical importance. While cities burned books for fuel and abandoned libraries to decay, the monasteries carefully maintained their collections of classical texts, religious writings, medical treatises, and historical chronicles. The plague years, paradoxically, became a period of intensive intellectual activity within monastic walls. The monasteries also served as refuges for plague survivors from the outside world. Though this hospitality was carefully managed to maintain the community's isolation and safety, some monasteries established guest houses outside their main walls where survivors could be housed, fed, and gradually integrated into the community if they showed no signs of disease. These practices allowed the monasteries to maintain their charitable mission while protecting their core communities from infection. The psychological atmosphere within plague-free monasteries during these years was markedly different. From the despair and terror, the monks' faith provided them with a framework for understanding the catastrophe unfolding beyond their walls. Interpreting it through biblical and theological perspectives that emphasized divine providence, this spiritual framework helped them maintain hope and purpose when secular society seemed to be collapsing completely. The regular cycle of prayers and religious observances provided structure and meaning that helped the monastic communities maintain their psychological. 8 times each day, the community would gather for prayer services that connected them, centuries of religious tradition, and reminded them of their ultimate spiritual goals. These services also provided opportunities for communal support and mutual encouragement. The monastery's role as centers of medical knowledge became particularly important during the plague years. Many monasteries maintained infirmaries and herb gardens where they practiced the most advanced medical care available in medieval Europe. While their treatments were still limited by medieval understanding of disease, monastic medical practitioners often had access to classical medical texts and centuries of accumulated practical experience. Some monasteries became repositories for plague refugees who had survived the disease. These survivors brought with them first-hand accounts of the plague's devastation, but they also represented hope for the future, living proof that the pestilence could be survived and that human communities could be rebuilt. The economic life of plague-free monasteries during this period. The monasteries continued to operate their workshops, producing textiles, metalwork, and other goods that would become increasingly valuable as secular production networks collapsed. Some monasteries actually became wealthier during the plague years, as they inherited property from religious benefactors who died. The agricultural productivity of the monasteries took on new significance, as food became scarce in many regions. The monastic communities not only fed themselves, but often had surplus grain and other foodstuffs that they could share with desperate survivors, or trade for goods they could not produce themselves. As the plague finally began to subside in the early 1350s, the monasteries emerged as crucial centers for the rebuilding of European civilization. Their preserved libraries provided the knowledge needed to restart educational institutions. Their maintained agricultural systems offered models for reorganizing farming in depopulated regions. Their surviving communities of educated men provided leadership and expertise for the enormous task of reconstructing European society. The experience of the plague-free monasteries during the Black Death demonstrates the power of preparation, isolation, and community discipline in surviving catastrophic events. These religious communities, through their commitment to self-sufficiency, cleanliness, and social cohesion, had inadvertently created the ideal conditions for surviving a pandemic that devastated less organized communities. The peaceful rhythm of monastic life during these terrible years also reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, it is possible to maintain islands of calm, learning, and hope. Within their walls, but human culture, knowledge, and the belief that civilization. And so we reach the end of our journey through one of history's most devastating pandemics. We've walked alongside medieval plague victims as they endured unimaginable suffering. Witnessed Giovanni Boccaccio documenting the collapse of civilization while laying the groundwork for a cultural rebirth. Explored the genetic mysteries that allowed some to survive when millions perished, and finally found peace within monastery walls, where life continued with remarkable normalcy. The story of the Black Death reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always threads of hope, resilience, and renewal. From the ashes of medieval Europe emerged the Renaissance, new ways of thinking about human nature and society, and ultimately, a stronger, more adaptable civilization. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep exploration into medieval Europe's most challenging time. Your support and engagement make these journeys possible, and I'm grateful for each of you who takes time to learn about these fascinating, if sometimes difficult chapters of our shared human story. I hope tonight's exploration has provided you with both knowledge and the peaceful rest you were seeking. Sweet dreams, and until our next historical adventure together. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more boring history to help you sleep. And don't forget to let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. Your suggestions help shape our future adventures together. Rest well, and good night.